I've recently come back from my second trip to Japan, and it really inspired me to talk about some of the absolutely incredible literature that has come out of Japan. I've read quite a number of Japanese books. However, for this video, I'm just going to walk through some of the Japanese classics and modern classics that I've read. I have a whole bunch of Japanese contemporary fiction that I could bring in, but I don't want this to be too long. So we're going to focus on literary classics from Japan for today. All of my Japanese classics live on this shelf. They go up to this stack and then a different section starts. So I'm going to be picking the books off of this shelf, and hopefully you can find some recommendations from this incredible world of literature. I want to start with my introduction to Japanese literary classics, which is Yasunari Kawabata. Apologies for any pronunciation issues. It's probably not that great. I have 4 of Kawabata's books. Kawabata is one of the greats of 20th century Japanese literature. His novels are often very quiet and emotionally elusive or emotionally detached, but it still communicates quite deeply what his characters are experiencing. Kawabata was born in Osaka in 1899, and he lost a lot of his immediate family when he was quite young. And the feeling of kind of loneliness and bereavement comes through in the novels of his that I've read so far. His fiction is really linked to Japanese aesthetics and this sort of awareness that things are beautiful because they don't last. The first book that I read from him was Snow Country, and this book centers on a very emotionally detached man in his relationship with a geisha, and it's set in an isolated mountain. Many of his fiction focus on a sort of doomed relationship between a man and a woman, and I find how he writes men and women really interesting. His women are often very vivid and disciplined and emotionally courageous, whereas his men are usually more passive or detached or voyeuristic. But his novels are usually from the male's perspective, meaning that his women become these aesthetic objects who are mysterious and beautiful and ultimately inaccessible. And I feel like Kawabata is fascinated by his female characters' inner lives, but he doesn't always grant these characters full freedom from the male gaze of their admirer. And his women's suffering is always turned into something exquisitely beautiful. Another book that I've read by him is Beauty and Sadness, again about a doomed relationship between a man and a woman. And here we find love really presented as a sort of sickness. And it does a really interesting job at exploring the question of whether art preserves suffering or whether art exploits suffering. The main character in this book, Oki, he has an affair with a woman named Otoko, and he transforms this affair into a novel that becomes very celebrated and successful. And again, he kind of transforms Otoko's suffering into an aesthetic object, and this past becomes beautiful because Oki edits out the kind of moral ugliness that their affair entailed. So he is able to revisit his past aesthetically without having to confront the damage that he has caused her. I've also read his short story collection, Palm of the Hand Stories. I did enjoy this collection, but I really am a novel lover. I sometimes struggle with short stories because I feel like I haven't yet gotten enough, but I think if you like short stories, you'll enjoy Kawabata's. And then a book that I got in Japan that I am about a third of the way through is his book Thousand Cranes, which I can't comment on yet because I haven't finished. But look at this gorgeous edition. So, so beautiful. Another absolute giant from the 20th century Japanese literary scene is Jun'ichirō Tanizaki. I have three of his books here that I have read. Tanizaki is, to me, a far more unsettling writer than Kawabata. Kawabata writes about beauty as something that is fragile and distant, whereas Tanizaki writes about beauty as a form of power, something that can enchant and ultimately corrupt. Tanizaki was born in Tokyo in 1886 and wrote through much of the 20th century. He has written across a variety of genres, but ultimately it is his expansive family portrait, The Makioka Sisters, that I've loved the most. It follows four sisters from a once prosperous Osaka merchant family as they try to preserve their dignity and their customs and their social position for in the years before the Second World War. We have a really interesting tension between traditional and more progressive in this book between the two sisters, Yukio and Taiko. Yukio embodies the family ideal of a traditional femininity, whereas Taiko is far more modern and works very hard to assert her independence. And what I find interesting is these two characters represent different responses to a changing society, but Junichiro Tanizaki doesn't make one or the other ultimately successful. He doesn't really pick a side in the way that we often find in novels. Yukio's traditional elegance protects her, but it makes her dependent on her family's fading social order, whereas Taiko's independence allows her to resist that order, but it opens her up to so many more vulnerabilities. And I think I was told that the title for this book in Japanese is more accurately translated into as like lightly falling snow or fine snow. And I think that works quite well because ultimately the book is about this family's slow and gradual decline. Like by the time the full weight of this decline has become visible, the old world has already been transformed. Another really interesting book of Tanizaki's is Naomi, and it's about an ordinary salaryman who becomes obsessed with this young girl named Naomi. And he tries to educate and reshape her into his obsessive ideal of a Western woman. But it's actually her that gradually gains control of him over time. You know, Joji, the salaryman, he thinks that he is creating Naomi, that he is teaching her how to dress and how to speak and how to behave. But the novel slowly reverses this fantasy until the man who wanted to control Naomi is ultimately the one who is dependent upon her approval. So it is partly about gender relations, but it's also to do with Japan's fascination with Western culture during the 1920s. And his, the Joji's obsession with Naomi is not ultimately about his obsession with her, it's about his obsession for the West. One that I got recently and haven't read is this collection of two novellas. I mentioned this in a previous book of mine. It's The Secret History of the Lord Musashi and Arrowroot. I also got this on my first trip to Japan, so I have another one of Tanizaki's books ready to go. Another kind of central Japanese classic writer is Natsume Sōseki. I have three of his books, I Am a Cat, Sanshiro, and Kokoro. Sōseki is also interested in themes of beauty and power that we can see in Kawabata and Tanizaki's work, but to me, his main preoccupation is about the loneliness that's created by modern individualism. His novels repeatedly ask what happens to people when they begin to think of themselves as individuals, as independent individuals, as they still live inside older systems of family, duty, loyalty, and social obligation that marked Japanese society. And his characters so often want freedom and they want sincerity, but in their quests for those things, they ultimately isolate themselves. And this makes sense for the time the Sōseki was alive. He was born in 1867, which was most of the Meiji period, and this was a period where Japan was undergoing a lot of change, political change, technological development, and a period of real cultural transformation. I think no book better captures these central themes than Kokoro. It follows an unnamed student who becomes fascinated by an older man whom he calls Sensei. And Sensei lives in this isolation and he frequents the grave of a friend, but he refuses to sort of elaborate on why he does this. And the final section is a long letter that gives us more insight into the character of Sensei. So in Kokoro, this loneliness is not because Sensei was without companions, but it was because of his secrecy. He's surrounded by all these relationships, but he's unable to engage with them because of this guilt that he feels and the secrecy around that guilt. The title Kokoro can suggest heart or like the inner core of a person. And the whole novel is kind of interested with this hidden region of a person that is not easily accessible to everyone. But my favorite of Soseki's books that I've read so far is I Am a Cat. Kokoro is very solemn. I Am a Cat is an excellent work of satire. And it's about this cat who observes his owner, who's an English teacher, and the group of intellectuals that he surrounds himself with. So the cat is watching modern Japan, trying to seem sophisticated, and he discovers that the intellectuals are often just vain and absurd and highly anxious. And so Soseki is sort of commenting on how modernization is not just a tragedy, but it's this comedy of imitation. And there's nothing truly sincere about it. And then I do have Sanshiro as well, but I haven't read this one yet, so can't comment. Next up, I want to talk about Akutagawa. I have two of his books, Rashomon and 17 Other Stories, which is a collection of his short fiction. And I also have Kappa, which is a tiny little novella that he wrote. Akutagawa's life and work is difficult to summarize. He was interested in a wide variety of things. I think what's so notable to talk about him is his he was born in 1892 in Tokyo. His mother developed a severe mental illness when he was very young, and he lived with extended family. His mother died, I forget the age, maybe 10 or 11, and he kind of lived with this fear that he would inherit the condition that his mother had, and that fear would kind of live with him for the rest of his life. Akutagawa did eventually take his own life in the 1920s, I believe. So his career is often read through this lens of a gradual descent toward collapse, but I think his work is far more varied than that. He was a comic satirist, he was also a literary critic, he was a scholar of older Japanese traditions, and of course, he was a great short story writer. His kind of major subject was the instability of the human mind, but he did approach this subject with a lot of clarity and discipline. And I think this is best illustrated in his short book Kappa, which follows a man confined to a psychiatric hospital. And it's quite Alice in Wonderland ish. The patient claims that he fell into an underground civilization inhabited by Kappa, which are creatures that come from Japanese folklore. And what I loved about Kappa Land is that it's not an escape from the human world. Akutagawa doesn't illustrate it that way. Kappa Land is like exposing all of the absurdities of the human world and all of the selfishness and the exploitation and the anxiety that the human world is filled with. And what I love is that it does have the trope of the unreliable narrator. Because the character is a psychiatric patient, we never know for sure whether Kappaland actually exists or whether it is a figment of his imagination or a hallucination. But what I love is that Akutagawa doesn't seem to use the character's madness to discredit him. Rather, it's that patient 23, the man, may perceive truths that apparently sane people ignore. And critics of the story have often disagreed whether or not Kappa should be read as a satire or as an expression of Akutagawa's private psychological suffering. Um, but I think the strongest interpretation is that it's both. It's that it's politics and it's his personal despair. Another Japanese classic writer who was also plagued by despair is Osamu Dazai. I've only read one book of his, which is No Longer Human, and I've only read one because I personally found this book very heavy and made me not want to reach for Osamu Dazai anytime too soon. No Longer Human is the last book that Osamu Dazai ever wrote shortly after he too took his own life with his partner at the time as well. And the book reads like someone who feels completely alienated from the human race, doesn't even feel human himself. And I would say proceed with caution. I think if you are not in a great headspace, it may be difficult to get through this book and it may make that headspace feel even worse. So definitely be ready for Osamu Dazai. He communicates the alienation that he feels from other people with such incredible precision and depth and clarity. He's a very, very successful writer and does what he aims to do with such precision. I now want to bring in Yūko Tsushima. I have already talked about her on my channel. She's one of my favorite Japanese classic writers. And I talked about her book, Women Running in the Mountains. So I'm not going to talk too much about this. I think it was in the first video I ever made on this channel. I give a deep dive, a bit of a deep dive into this book. I also have Child of Fortune and Territory of Light. And I bring up Yūko Tsushima now because Yūko Tsushima was the daughter of Osamu Dazai. Osamu Dazai died when Yūko Tsushima was 1 year old, so she never knew her father. She also had a brother who died when she was young as well. And so death and absent fathers and unconventional family structures are present in all of her work that I've read. As an adult, Yūko Tsushima married, she had 2 children, and then ultimately did become a single mother. Her son also died from an illness at the age of 8, and her early fiction focuses a lot on what it's like to raise children on your own as a woman. Her father's reputation obviously followed her throughout her life, but she developed an incredibly unique identity, very different from his. Osamu Dazai focused a lot on the alienated male artist, whereas she wrote about the women and children whose experience had often remained peripheral in Japanese society. One of my favorites is Territory of Light, which is about a separated woman who moves to this apartment that is very, very bright with her 2-year-old daughter. And the novel unfolds over 1 year of her life as she tries to manage work and children and loneliness, all while her estranged husband avoids the responsibility of raising his child. And then Child of Fortune focuses on a recently divorced mother who finds out she's pregnant by another man. And she uses the pregnancy to kind of explore the expectations surrounding female adulthood. Coco, the main character, her pregnancy forces her to confront the society in which she lives in, where a woman's body is treated as like a public question. Everyone seems entitled to decide what kind of mother she is, whether she should have the child, and what shape her life should take. And what I really love about Child of Fortune is that the novel doesn't turn Coco into the triumphant feminist hero. You know, Coco is contradictory. She's sometimes very irresponsible and she's very uncertain about what she wants. And so Tsushima allows her this sort of moral complexity rather than making her into an archetype, which is something I really, really respect. Next up, I want to talk about Kōbō Abe. Kōbō Abe has so many books, but I only have 3 and have only read 1. Kōbō Abe was born in Tokyo in 1924, but he grew up in Japanese occupied Manchuria. But after Japan's defeat in the Second World War, he returned to a country which was legally his home but really didn't feel like one. And this experience of displacement shaped his distrust in ideas like homeland or community and belonging. And he later in his life described himself as someone without a hometown. The book that I have read by him is his most famous book, The Woman in the Dunes, which follows our main character, Nikki, who is a school teacher and an amateur entomologist who travels to a remote area to collect insects. And after missing the last bus, he accepts shelter in a house at the bottom of a sand pit. But when he wakes up the next morning, the rope ladder has been removed and he's trapped. And while this situation is very surreal, the questions that arise for Nicky during his entrapment feel very familiar, like who are we without our job, our address, our documents, and our recognition of other people? It's excellent. One of my favorite books from everything that I've talked about so far. And yes, I do also have the Secret Rendezvous and the Boxman, and I hope to get to these ones very shortly. No video looking at Japanese classics is complete without mentioning Yukio Mishima. Here I have The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, The Frolic of the Beasts, and Death in Midsummer. Where to even begin when talking about Yukio Mishima? It's truly such a struggle. He was born in Tokyo in 1925. He was raised by his aristocratic grandmother. He was very physically frail when he was young, but then he became a bodybuilder and a martial artist as he aged, and of course, a literary prodigy who published a massive variety of books. But it's impossible to talk about him without talking about the end of his life, because Mishima became increasingly involved in nationalistic politics during the 1960s. He criticized post war Japan for abandoning the emperor's sacred status. And in the 60s, he formed a small militia, and the members were trained in military discipline and promoted loyalty to the emperor. I mean, this group was authoritarian, militaristic, and very kind of radically nationalist. And Mishima was presenting himself as a defender of traditional Japan. And this ultimately led to the 25th of November 1970, when Mishima and several members from his group entered a Japanese self defense force headquarters in Tokyo and took a senior officer hostage. And Mishima addressed the crowd, essentially calling on them to reject the post war constitutional order and restore political power to the emperor. This attempted coup or uprising ultimately did fail, and Mishima then died by seppuku inside the building. And in so many ways, I mean, this end was, of course, a personal catastrophe ultimately, but it was also, I think, in looking at Mishima's life, it was the way in which to end his story with the deliberate mythology that he created around himself. That makes his life kind of makes a lot of sense and relates a lot to The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. This follows a group of adolescent boys who believe that adult society is weak and overly sentimental and hypocritical. And one of the young boys begins to idolize this sailor as this heroic figure attached to freedom and, navigating the dangers of the sea. But then this sailor ultimately abandons sailing for a domestic life with the boy's mother, and the boy sees this as the ultimate betrayal. The sailor has ultimately exchanged greatness for just ordinary happiness. And the boy's idea of heroism, like, he can't tolerate an ordinary human life. And he has a lot of contempt for things like love and responsibility because they involve compromise. And to the boy, you cannot compromise on greatness, which does explain a lot about where Mishima's philosophy and ideology ultimately comes from, these ideas of no place for normalcy. I did enjoy Death in Midsummer. This is a collection of short stories because it showed me that Mishima can also have comedy and humor in his works, and that it wasn't all deeply serious, disturbing, and dire. And I haven't read The Frolic of Beasts yet. Mishima has so many books, so I do hope to slowly work my way through his bibliography. Next up, I want to talk about Fumiko Enchi. Fumiko Enchi was born in 1905 in Tokyo and is one of the great writers from 20th century Japan. There is a lot of suppressed anger in Enchi's work, and I have here her novel Masks. Masks is a sort of very strange book about a woman named Miko, who is an older woman who exercises a lot of powerful influence on her widowed daughter-in-law and the men around them. And the masks in the novel are connected to no theatre, which is a tradition of theatre where a fixed mask can appear to change according to the angle and the light. And she uses this idea to suggest that, a personality or a person is layered as opposed to stable. And there's a lot of mystery and manipulation in the pages of this book. I'd really love to read more from Fumiko Enchi. I'm very interested. Fumiko Enchi was also very inspired by The Tale of Genji by Murasaki Shikibu. Very difficult to talk about Japanese literature or Japanese classic literature without mentioning The Tale of Genji. This book was written in the 11th century, and the author was a lady in the Heian court of Japan, and it's generally considered one of the world's first novels. The novel follows the life of this very beautiful and cultivated prince whose romantic pursuits carry him through the Heian court. And it's also a record of the women who wait behind the screens after Genji has moved on. Over the course of the novel, youth fades, relationships dissolve, and the radiant prince himself disappears. And the book becomes this look at just the impermanence of life. And I took away from it that the world is beautiful not because we can preserve it, but because every person inside of it is already passing into memory. And we're not here forever, only for a brief moment. And that's ultimately where the beauty of life can stem from. The last writer slash book that I want to talk about is Otohiko Kaga, and I have here his massive book, Marshland. Otohiko Kaga was born in Tokyo in 1929, and Kaga belonged to a generation whose whole adolescence was shaped by wartime Japan. And one of his major concerns is how ordinary people can become implicated in national violence. Marshland follows our main character, Otsuo, who's a former soldier who has built a very modest and very disciplined life for himself. But then he becomes entangled in this criminal investigation, and the legal system begins treating his past as like evidence of a present guilt. And it's like the deeper that Atsuo enters the legal system, the harder it is for him to distinguish between assumption and guilt. And we've reached the end. That's all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed going through the labyrinth that is Japanese literature. I didn't bring in more contemporary Japanese writers just because I felt that the video would be too long, but there are many who I love. Banana Yoshimoto, off the top of my head, is one of my all-time favorites. So I might do a video focused on contemporary Japanese writers as well, because it's a country whose literature I have just completely fallen in love with. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I've been to Japan twice and hope to go there again and again. It's a country that's just so rich with culture and history and incredible experiences. So I hope you enjoyed this, and hopefully I'll see you in another video shortly. Bye.